my social media. Yeah, yeah, and they did too. Yeah, we're good. So we can start. Yeah. Okay. So welcome to this special conversation with one of our authors for this year's book fair. My name is Sarah Onyango, and I am a community radio host and producer at CHUO 89.1 FM. And I'm very pleased today to introduce to you Ainalem Tebeje. Ainalem Tebeje is a longtime resident of Ottawa, uh, someone who has been educated in at least three different education systems in Ethiopia, in India, and here in Canada. She has a very diverse background, all connected to communication, literature, mass communication, and journalism. And her book is The Refugee, which is a sequel to a novel that she published in 2018 entitled My Love Story in Broken English. Before I get into my questions about this particular book, can you give us a sense of your refugee story to Canada?
Um, First of all, we are lucky to have Mosaic Interculturel. Um, where else could we have had such an exposure of our work? So I would like to start by saying merci, Mosaic Interculturel, bravo, keep up the good work. Next, Sarah and myself, two sisters from the continent next door.
Exactly. I'm from Kenya. You're from Ethiopia.
We meet in this beautiful indigenous land
Hmm.
and we talk about literature. How beautiful is that?
That's quite amazing.
I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you, Sarah. What a great time. Now, coming to being a refugee, my journey has been long, difficult, interesting, but joyful. I come from a very small family, and when we had what they called the revolution, the royalty was overthrown. We had a military government, and this was the time when people were running away because of the young, the academia, the royalty, the aristocrats, the rich were being persecuted.
This was in the 70s.
Yes. So the first request of my mother was, please wait, I don't have much time left. I'm going to die soon. You can go right after my funeral, but please don't leave while I'm alive. Well, I managed to stay for a few years, kept quiet, never complained. I was a young journalist trying to support my family and also to stay alive. But there came a time when this was not possible. So I was targeted. It was just a matter of time. I would be in prison, and then it's your fate is in their hands. So I went to my mother and I said, Mother, I think they're going to kill me. Would you rather have me here and find out that I'm dead one day, or would you rather here I'm alive somewhere and maybe one day we can get together? So my mother, um, she teared up and she said, I knew this day was coming. You can go. You have my blessing. So this is how I left. And it so happened I came to Canada. I had nothing. I knew not a single person. I joined Carleton. I did my master's in journalism. And as fate had it, I met a professor at Carleton who I went to interview for my thesis. And again, this journey of mine, we ended up spending 25 years in happy marriage.
Hmm.
And he died a few years ago. That was a crushing experience. I lost my support system. I lost my guide, I lost my friend, and I was crushed. But I think I've recovered.
Mm-hmm.
So this was my companion during my grieving period.
Mm-hmm.
It started as a memoir,
Mm-hmm.
but I was overwhelmed with grief. I couldn't continue. So I stopped writing about myself and turned it into a novel. And this is the sequel.
Mm-hmm.
It's the story of the same girl.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot about me, not in a direct way, but having gone through the same journey.
Mm-hmm.
So,
So,
briefly,
can we go back to how you got to Canada? Because refugees, in the Canadian mainstream, there's a lot of sort of imagery around the refugee story, and a lot of the people who come here from East Africa, because I remember in the late 80s, early 90s, it was the Somalis. It was a lot of refugees from the Horn of Africa, and a lot of them had gone through refugee camps. Are you saying that was not your experience?
so mine is a little bit different.
Mm-hmm.
I had two choices to walk to Somalia
Mm-hmm.
or to walk to the Sudan. In both cases, I would have died. I'm not that kind. I don't have that energy. I don't have that determination. And I had to find a third option. So uh, this was the time when Ethiopia was a communist nation.
Yeah.
And there were elements uh, that were against the system. And one of those were Western groups, Western organizations. So I went to Rotary Foundation. This was a club of Western diplomats who were meeting once a week or once a month, I can't remember. So I went very secretly and I told them they're going to kill me. Could you please save my life? And they said, well, we can't get you out of the country. You're already a known journalist. You said you can't walk to the two countries. What other option do we have? So I said, if you have a scholarship, any scholarship, give it to me. And I will prove to you that I am a deserving case. So I was given a scholarship. It took a while, of course. I had to compete. And God willing, I won that competition. I got the scholarship. But Rotary Foundation, they give you the money. And then they say, okay, here is money for your tuition fee, for your transport, and you find your own school. And there was one graduate of Carleton in the Rotary Foundation. He was Ethiopian, a former Minister of Information who graduated from Carleton. I approached him and he said, this was a previous minister who was demoted by the communist government, so he was in my favor. He said, well, okay, um, if you want to go, my first choice, I would recommend Carleton. And he said, I can also support you. I send a support letter and approach some of the professors. So I applied to Carleton. I was accepted. And this
And
is
that's
how
and
I
that's how
got
you
here.
got here.
Yeah.
So let's get back to your book. So the first in the first book we meet um, um, I forget what what her name
Almaz.
is. Almaz, that's right, and she's 14 years old. So we're talking about a child bride, a 14-year-old. What made you choose a child bride as a protagonist
Yeah.
for that first book?
Well, I chose Almaz Teferra, a child bride, who is the protagonist of the story. She's the raconteur because I wanted to get to her husband. She tells the story, but the real message is in her husband. Her husband was a remarkable man, a young boy, 20-year-old, and he married this 14-year-old child. So after their marriage, he refused to consummate the marriage. He said, "You're too young, it's too risky, I'm not going to consummate the marriage." 6 months later, she was not pregnant. So she was suspected to be infertile. And the in laws asked her to go back home to her parents, which is a divorce. And he refused. He said, "She's the love of my life. She's not going anywhere. She'll get pregnant in due time." But then they were expelled, they were disowned, they were condemned, and he was made fun of. Um, he literally was excluded from the society. Eventually, she got sick, and the government wouldn't give him permission to take her to the city for medical treatment. So he decides to take a secret route to the neighboring country to get her medical help. And on the way, he dies. So this is a tragic story, but we have a man here who stood up against his family, his village, his culture, his values, his society, his government for the sake of his wife.
Hmm.
And then he says, "It's not just about you, it's about all women." So, my message in this book is gender issues are not a problem of women.
Hmm.
Women are often expected to solve gender inequality. They are the ones who are targeted. And I'm saying men have as much responsibility in creating the inequality, and they have as much responsibility in putting an end to it. So that's how I happen to choose her.
Hmm. And that sort of flows into my next question because I hear the activist in that sort of writing. How much, because your background is a journalist, but you're also very much an activist. How much of your journalism and activism goes into the way you write about these issues?
Um, Everything. I spent most of my time as a refugee, as an immigrant, as someone from outside. The greater part of my life was spent in places where I did not belong. So everything I do, it could be my frame of reference, my thinking, my writing, is about my journey. I had a very amazing journey. It was a journey of pain, it was a grief about loss, and it was a grief about love and triumph. So if you were to ask me to write about a celebrity in Hollywood, I can't write a single word. But if you ask me to write about refugees in a camp, I can write as if I lived there forever.
Hmm.
So my advocacy work, my writing, my way of living is very much diasporic. It's part of me now. I lived, all my friends, some of my family members are a product of migration. So I think it's not a choice, but it's been integral to my thinking.
Hmm. Um, so after writing two books about the just the way societal pressures weigh on women's lives, like Alma's with being a 14-year-old and a child bride, and then in this book, arriving as a widow now and having to deal with adjusting to a new society. So, what are your thoughts on the emancipation of refugee women in Canadian society? Because there's how they emancipate themselves in their own society of origin, back on the continent, and here. What are your thoughts on that?
Um, I'm not worried about refugee women um, because refugee women are drowning in the Mediterranean Sea.
Mm.
They are dying in the Sinai Desert. They're selling them in slave markets. They're burning them alive. They're attacking them. They're raping them. These are the women who haven't made it to Canada and they're voiceless. Nobody knows about them, and those who know about it, they don't care. I want to be their voice. I may not be that important, but in whatever way I can, whether it's advocacy work or my writing, these are the women I want to talk about. These are the women who keep me awake. These are the women I'm worried about. We're losing young, energetic, hopeful women in the sea, in the desert, in prisons, in every country. In the Mediterranean, European countries are closing their borders. Israel and Egypt are closing their borders because they don't want them. Yemen, they're killing them, they're burning them. So everywhere they go, the plight is uh, unspeakable. You can see the worst of humanity in refugee camps. So, if I were to give priority, these are the women I want to talk about. These are the women who worry me.
Hmm. And yeah, that's a point well taken, and I can see the emotion and the concern in your eyes and in your voice. And in fact, you've actually been successful in the past in drawing attention to the plight of vulnerable people. Do you care to share about the role you played in raising awareness about the famine in Ethiopia?
So,
This was in the 80s.
yes, 1985, I was a new immigrant, not even a year, a student of Halton, very poor, living with a senior citizen. And I get a phone call from the African Famine Relief Office asking me to go to Toronto to be with Canadian artists who were singing Tears Are Not Enough.
Hmm.
This is the fundraising.
Hmm.
So when I got to the recording studio, that's when it hit me. I said, oh, these are celebrities, these are important people, and what am I supposed to do with them? So I was asked just to stand up and say a few words, and I did. And of course,
You said quite a few words. It was quite stunning, actually, that press
yeah,
conference.
I'm always emotional,
Yeah.
and I think I broke down, and most of them were also emotional.
Hmm.
But that was 1985, so I think that's part of the
And it
journey.
worked. And
I hope so.
it was very, very effective. And for those of you who don't know about the Tears Are Not Enough initiative, that was the Canadian version of We Are the World, right?
Yes.
It was the Canadian version of that. So let's get back to your book. So there's a lot of reference to the strength, the resilience, the getting back up and overcoming and all of that. And um, thank you. And I've heard a lot of Black women, uh, different kinds, not just refugee women, but Black women here in North America, talking about how exasperated they are about talking about Black resilience. This, you know, this portrayal of the Black experience on this continent being about survival, resilience. What are your thoughts on that?
Uh, by and in itself, resilience is not a bad word.
Mm.
The way it's being applied to Black women is the issue.
Hmm.
If we look at African American literature, like Robin Hughes and Gail Parker and Ibram Kendi, um, Black women are expected to be strong, patient, resilient, careful, um, happy, And so
Forgiving,
forgiving,
tolerant.
understanding.
Hmm.
Now the question is, how in a society where you are undervalued, where you're seen more as a problem than an asset, where you are facing hurdles every day, how is it possible that you're resilient every day? So the moment these women they show a reaction, sadness, anger, speaking out, protesting, they're seen as overreacting,
Hmm.
the
Angry
angry
black
black
woman.
woman. They're not patient. They're making up stories. They're exaggerating. So that's where the issue is. Um, how long does one become resilient? 1,000 years? Are these women not human beings? Can when their husbands are murdered, their children are in prison, they can't find jobs in their field? Do they have a right to react as human beings? And does that have to be madness every day? This is what the problem is. So I think the whole definition of resilience needs to be looked at in the context of Black experience.
Hmm. And in your book, I noticed there's moments of lightness, there's joking, there's cute little moments. How do you determine sort of the dosage of expressing the seriousness and the difficulty of being of that refugee experience, and then the moments of humanity and lightness and fun? How do you choose how to dose that?
Well, well, I guess that's an Ethiopian gift.
Oh.
Yeah, we grieve,
Hmm.
just like I'm doing now. I'm weeping, and in a moment I'm laughing.
Hmm.
We grieve, and right in the middle of mourning, uh, we have a time of telling jokes and laughing. It's part of our culture. We don't carry grief to the end. We have intermittent happy moments where we make light things, we make jokes, we laugh, we lighten the problem. Um, Maybe it's not understood in other cultures, but this is how I grew up. Uh, we cry, we suffer, we are in pain, but we also make time to laugh. So in my book, that's why I have light moments which are funny and a little bit on the lighter tone, but it's a story of grief at the same time.
How did you choose the titles of your different chapters? Because some of them, well, there's this one, a child cannot have a child, and then you have another one, God never asks for a salary, a reward, or a bribe. Like, how did you choose the different? And there was one about you can take the African out of Africa, but not Africa out of the African. How do you choose those titles?
Well, it took me a while um, to identify the relevant ones for the story, the ones that are crisp but meaningful,
Hmm.
that would make one understand that chapter.
Hmm.
For example, it's common in the African culture. We say, for example, we have in Ethiopia, we have a coffee ceremony.
Yes. Yeah.
And that coffee ceremony is not just drinking and running away. You sit, you make the coffee. It's a time for women to spend some time. It's a catharsis. I do that here. Even when I know that I don't have that much time, it's not necessary. I don't even have friends to be with me because it's the African in me. The African in me is always asking for things that I valued back home. So in this book, what I did was I went back home and I collected all those sayings. And then I checked one by one which one is relevant, which one is understandable, which one, could people relate. For example, God doesn't ask for salary. It's a common thing in our language.
Mm. Mhm.
We say, oh, you have good health, you're happy, and yet God never asked you to pay him for all birthday, so you better be thankful.
Mm.
That's how I happen to choose them.
No. Now, one topic that I was reading along and everything was great, and then all of a sudden she falls in love with this white man. So the issue of interracial relationships, how what was your approach to that?
Yeah. Um,
Because that does end up being a common phenomenon here in Canada.
so let me tell you what my brother said. Uh, After he read this book, I think he was jealous because at the end, she marries a white man.
Hmm.
He says, "Oh, why did you marry her to a white man? Couldn't she find an Ethiopian?" So, this book, it has a message. My message in this book is this: we are all creatures of one God. We are all residents of one planet, and we are all members of one human. The rest we've created it. Black, white, east, west, communist, capitalist, slave owner and slave, rich and poor. These are what we created to dominate each other, to divide each other, and to fight each other, to kill each other. So in this book, you will find Almaz. Almaz's best friend is Salma.
Hmm.
Almaz is Christian, Salma is Muslim.
Okay.
They live in the same house. They pray. They pray for Christian God and Muslim Allah. They celebrate Eid al-Fitr and Christmas. They share their culture. That's what I wanted to show. At the end of the day, we're all the same. Then Almaz, who comes from a village, who had never seen a white person when she was growing up, she falls in love with this man. Why? Because he understood her as a human being. He stood for her. He is like Lemata Sema. He was hounded. They were making fun of him. You remember, they said,
Hmm.
"Oh, where did you find her?"
Hmm. Hmm.
He was hurt by what she was going through. So that's what I wanted to show, that the diversity is a human thing. It's what we have done with our differences. That's the problem.
Hmm. So, speaking of the theme of this book fair, explore your identity. So, how does one, like a refugee who has lost their cultural sort of context and support, how do they explore and then find and then recreate their identity here in Canadian society, which is full of different identities, even from the African continent, all these different identities? How do you recreate? How do you reinvent yourself identity wise?
Um, Refugee is an immigration status. You're not always a refugee.
Hmm.
You are a refugee at some point, then you become a permanent resident, then you are a citizen. But the experience of refugee lives with you. You know, you could be a citizen for your life, but that 1 year you spent as a refugee is what forms you. So in the African diaspora, I'm taking my own country as an example, Ethiopia. Survival was the raison d'etre when we were living on. All we wanted was to be alive, not to be killed, uh, not to be sold, not to be raped. That's how brought us to where we are. Once we got here, then you notice that it's not enough. You're a human being, you're alive, but what are you going to do with this life? You need to be where you should. If you have education, training, expertise, degrees, we don't have that. So, in a way, I go to church. I'm a church person. I go to church a lot. In my church, we have engineers, doctors, and they pray. And I'm telling them, that's not going to do it. You need to go out and fight for your place because God has given you the education, the brain that you need. Now it's up to you. So basically, we spend a lot of time for survival, trying to find our place in society to be where we should be. That forms our identity.
Hmm.
Uh, like if you talk to an Ethiopian refugee, they want to tell you, oh, this is my society and belongs to me. And they say, okay, I'm part of this society. I have come here with some asset, education, work experience, and I want to use it to give back and also to improve myself. So that place in our society, our identity in the Africa diasporic, is maybe something we need to study because to me, my personal experience is we spend a lot of time on the things that are urgent and that identity becomes only part of it.
Hmm. And lastly, I mean, so now this is two books you've written about the refugee experience, and these are not the first books that have been written about the refugee experience. But as a journalist, I want you to put your journalist hat on now. How has the way the media covers refugees, how has it changed from when you started out in the 80s to now? Or has it?
Um, do you remember the Me Too campaign?
Yes.
Do you remember the extent of coverage,
Oh, yeah.
the anger, the feminist movement,
Hmm.
the women speaking and writing and angry? Right now, as we speak, women are being raped by soldiers. Uh, women are being enslaved. Women are left to drown. Have you heard anything from
Very little.
Western
Maybe
feminine?
maybe out of Ukraine. A little. Out of Ukraine.
So for me, it's time that we forget these people. The media is not going to speak for us. Let's create our own voice. Let's become our own medium. It doesn't matter. We may not have the resources, but even if we have to do it by word of mouth, even if we have to do it through advocacy, I will not ask the media to speak for me anymore. I've given up.
Well, thank you very much for that, and thank goodness you are writing about these refugee experiences. Ainalem Tebeje, everybody.
Thank you, Sarah, for the opportunity.